Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Anita Dolcevita and I'm the owner of dapperQ. And on behalf of the dapperQ family, I just wanted to hope that you are all safe, healthy, and whole during these challenging times. The current global health crisis has impacted our communities in unique ways, often cutting us off from vital resources, including community centers, clinics, bars, and events. So in an effort for us to stay connected, dapperQ has curated some virtual panels. This is the first of many panels, and it's Go Big or Go Home, plus size inclusivity in queer fashion. And we have a great lineup of speakers here today. I'm very excited to introduce them. But instead of watching me read their bios, I'm going to put up a slide that includes where you can find them on social media and where you can donate to them on Venmo if they provided Venmo. Some people are freelancers. We ask that if you have the means to provide, there's no amount that is too small or too big. Obviously, too big is good. And also, John is donating his portion of whatever's donated to him to a charity that I will discuss during the introduction. So please bear with me because I'm new to Zoom, but I am going to share their slides now. Okay. So first up, we have Dr. Van Bailey. Van is a student affairs educator, international speaker, diversity consultant, and collective member of Brooklyn Boyhood. With over 13 years of experience in higher education and nonprofits, Van's speeches and workshops relate to LGBTQ student leadership, I can never say this word, pedagogical practice, and intersectionality. Van's styling and fashion uplifts ancestral adornment and centers Black boys of size. Next, we have Ulanday Barette, named one of 9 transgender and gender nonconforming writers you should know by Vogue. Kay is a poet, performer, and cultural strategist. Kay has been featured at the Lincoln Center, the UN, Symphony Space, Princeton University, Tucson Poetry Festival, the Dodge Poetry Foundation, the Hemispheric Institute, and Brooklyn Museum. They are a 2-time Pushcart Prize nominee, Best of Net Split This Rock 2019 nominee, and 2019 Queeroes Literary Honoree by Them Condé Nast. They have served on numerous boards and panels, and their work has been featured in the New York Times, the Academy of Poets, BuzzFeed, Asian American Literary Review, PBS News, the Huffington Post, Bitch Magazine, The Advocate, and more. Published in 2020 by Sibling Rivalry Press, is their second collection. I'm sorry, Kay, you'll have to join in and tell us later your name of your book, but currently Kay lives outside of New York City area with his jolly dog and remixes his mama's recipes whenever possible. Next, we have Jahn Hall, who is an industry veteran and the owner of Consortium New York City, a creative services agency supporting both new and established apparel and lifestyle brands. With 30 years in the industry, Jahn has worked with brands like David Hart, Kramer and Stout, The Project Trade Show, and dapperQ, among many other works, as a personal stylist and shopper for clients around the country. When he's not working, he enjoys staying home during an incredibly surreal time with his husband and dog. John will be donating any contribution to his Zoom to New Alternatives, an organization dedicated to increasing the self-sufficiency of LGBTQ+ homeless youth and young adults by enabling them to transition out of the shelter system to stable adult lives. And we also have Amy Stretten, who is a bilingual Native American Black and white femme journalist and plus-size fashion blogger from Los Angeles. She created The Chief of Style to celebrate her love of fashion and chronicle her journey towards radical self-acceptance. As a social media influencer, she has worked with several size-inclusive and queer-centered brands like Tomboy X, Duzo, and Universal Standard. As a journalist, Amy has told the stories of marginalized and otherwise overlooked communities for outlets such as the New York Post, ABC Univision, and CNN. In 2018, Amy partnered with Dove and news outlet Mike to produce a short documentary on femme invisibility. In 2019, she was the face of Lane Bryant's Pride collection. Amy is also a Sustainable Fashion Reporting Fellow with Mode Durable, a program at the Parsons School of Design in New York. Amy has worked for several mainstream and Indigenous news organizations around the US and Canada. So welcome, everyone. I am going to join back in. And Kay, if you could give us the name of your book, I'm really sorry. Somehow that got cut off in my email. Oh, you're on mute.
Hey, y'all. Yeah, my book is More Than Organs. That's all. It's cute. You know, whole bodies, more than our insides. So check it out. It's poetry. It's trans and brown and wobbly. So, boop, boop.
Go get it. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I guess to kick off our conversation, what I wanted to start with is talking a little bit about dapperQ. We celebrated our 10-year anniversary last year. It's hard to believe. In 2009, there were very few, if any, fashion lines that were dedicated to serving our community specifically, not to even to mention inclusive of size. Today we have more queer style options, but many of them are still lacking in size inclusion. So despite the growing number of queer fashion lines, many plus size queer consumers are still feeling erased and underserved. So I'd like to hear from all of you. What is your take on the current state of plus size inclusion in queer fashion? And that can be from a media standpoint, that can be from a designer standpoint, just to kick off the conversation.
I'll start. Just to break the ice and the awkwardness. I will say that the state of it is very different than it was 10 years ago. So I will say, you know, to make a note, when Brooklyn Boyhood first came out 10 years ago as well, we celebrated our 10-year anniversary. One of the reasons why we produced calendars was because there was very little images out there, particularly of masculine-centered Black and brown folks in the media. We couldn't find any magazine we opened up. We couldn't find any. Anytime we looked online to find any, we couldn't find any. So we had to create it ourselves. And so I would say that that's very different now that we have Instagram, and there are some folks, you know, in the industry who are trying to bring more visibility to those bodies. However, it is very much lacking. I think that there is still a long ways to go when we're thinking about all types of bodies, particularly for masculine-centered folks. You know, when I see designers who are centering trans-masculine bodies on the runway, they're oftentimes thin. They're oftentimes considered passable and consumable for cis folks. And it's definitely not bodies that look like mine. And so, you know, I would even say when searching for plus size things online or fashion, you know, you might go to the plus size area in the section and the models still don't look like me. And so, you know, I think there can be definitely more folks who can speak on that, but we still have a ways to go when it comes to that inclusion. But I will say it is different than it was 10 years ago. Still doesn't mean that we're there yet, you know? Yeah,
absolutely. And in your efforts to create that calendar, did you have to overcome any specific obstacles? Because I know sometimes with dapperQ, some people who are of size don't feel comfortable being models because they've never been a model before, or they don't have the wardrobe because those types of offerings were never available to them before.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think that the curation of our photo shoots were so important. When we actually got the models, right? And the fact that it was oftentimes a celebration, you know, almost like a party atmosphere when we brought those folks on to do the shoot with us. But we would have to personally tap some folks sometimes, right? Like when we were doing just digital calls or things like that, it was the same bodies. And so we had to be the ones to reach out to our homies, to reach out to folks that we thought were fine and beautiful and handsome, or folks who we knew were not going to be, maybe consider themselves the flyest folks, right? But we saw, you know, kind of the representation there. And so we would have to do that outreach. and it was very challenging. I would say it's challenging to this day, right? I don't know many platforms of trans, masculine, of size folks who are thriving, right? When I think about Instagram, when I think about these other visual platforms, when we think about those particular intersections, it's just not happening, right? And so I think that there is still a need for that visibility. And even, you know, we have to continue to have the conversation about the psychological impacts that this exclusion does to communities, and particularly communities that, you know, look like folks who are associated with Brooklyn Boyhood or see Brooklyn Boyhood as folks who are in the forefront of putting those bodies out there. Most of the people in our collective are people of size, right? So how could we not reach out to those folks and make sure that that visibility was out there?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think
Jahn?
if you don't, I remember, it's funny, we talk about modeling. A whole generation ago, I actually was a model, and I was a big and tall model. And I remember doing a series of shows within malls. This is like in the late 80s, early 90s when malls were a thing. There are some shows I couldn't do because there was nothing in the mall that catered to anyone larger. And when there was, it was one store that catered to a much older demographic. And here I was, this young kid, watching all these other models in traditional sizes.
Sorry about that.
Wearing really cool stuff. And here I was, like, trying to work with the stylist and not just start crying because I felt like there was nothing for me out there. And yes, a lot has changed, but there's still very little out there for me.
Yeah.
I wanted for my wedding to get a custom-made suit done. The suit arrived and was completely wrong, and they couldn't even do anything to adjust the fit. So again, I was forced to go to a store that I would not feel great about going into because it wasn't aspirational, it wasn't cool, and try to find something. And that experience was incredibly upsetting. I walked out of the store, and I'm getting emotional thinking about it now, but I started crying because this is supposed to be the most amazing day of our lives, and I could not feel amazing in what I was wearing. Thankfully, a friend of mine was able to make a beautiful sweater for me to wear, and I felt like $1 million. It was an amazing day, but it was a really humiliating experience to go into a mass store and not find anything that fits. One of the things we've discussed collectively before this opened up to everyone was the challenges of then trying to shop online, and the challenges that we face because often the clothing is shown on traditional sized models, or because the reality is that bigger bodies come in so many different shapes and so many different variations. You know, I happen to carry all my weight around my belly, and I call it my bagel because it literally looks like I'm wearing an inner tube around my waist at all times. I love my bagel, but it's hard to fit. Mm-hmm. So trying to shop online is incredibly difficult because while there may be options, you often have to buy 2, 3, 4, 5 sizes to try to figure out which one may work for you. In a community where we already feel a huge sense of otherness for a variety of reasons and for various experiences that people live with, this just adds another layer. Suddenly, you know, we for those that are coming with trans experience, these folks are trying to get dressed. You know, they've just come into their own in their bodies, and they're doing whatever they can. And suddenly there's this additional challenge of trying to just get dressed and to be able to express themselves in a way that they'd like to. For me, I am a cisgender male. However, that otherness still existed because being a larger person within the LGBTQI+ community is incredibly difficult. And I feel like some things have changed. And thankfully, as I've gotten older, I've started to own my body and the body that I've been given more, but it's still a huge challenge in trying to go out and shop. There's still huge opportunities for both mass brands and local queer-owned brands to address that. And there are some custom options, but the cost is prohibitive for somebody like me. I can't afford those things.
Yeah.
So yeah, I feel like we've made some steps, but we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Kay, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I think what's really important to me, and I'm speaking as somebody who purchases, who believes in aesthetic. As a cultural strategist, I try to identify what about fashion and aesthetic not only moves my individuality forward, but what are the patterns of my communities. And so for me, Instagram and social media have throttled what it feels like to be. And for me, I'm a small chub guy, right? So in my own privilege, what does that mean? But also too, as when I'm talking about trans masculinity, I'll use this case, for example. If I'm going on a group on Facebook, just on T guys or non-binary folks, and we're comparing our chests without clothes on, you see the metrics of skinny, fit, able people and how they are celebrated, how they are rejoiced, and how fat bodies, soft bodies, super fat bodies are not given that same uplift. So my questions are, even before we get the clothes on, how are we considering what is desirable, right? And when I'm considering disability justice too, I've luckily in some ways been replenished actually by disabled designers, like Rebirth Garments that features fat folks or super fat folks, right? So there's this overlap for me where I've noticed where disability justice, where our tenets are like all bodies, all selves are valid, where fatness is then in overlap as a celebration, right? Because if we consider why skinny fit fashion is in play, it's this false sense of health, it's this false sense of worth, it's this false sense of desirability, and also this false sense of capital, right? And that, we're living in a pandemic now. We know how fat people are being treated. We know how Black and Indigenous, POC, Latinx femmes are being treated. And we know how disabled people are being treated. And so when we're thinking about aesthetic, for me as a cultural worker, I just want to consider the narratives, much like what Van and both John have talked about. What are we internalizing? And yeah, I could try to shop ASOS all day, but what happens when you don't have financial access? What happens when anytime I see a style influencer, I'm classed. So I'm like, how do you got a new outfit every day, every post?
Yeah.
Oof. I know you're like in the Philippines or in India, there's no freaking mosquito net. Like, these are professional folks. I'm an influencer by grassroots.
Yeah.
So my questions are, how do we support each other in that?
Yeah.
And
that's interesting because, Instagram does serve as a platform to provide us with visibility to that we don't have to rely on mainstream media to get our voices and our bodies out there, to serve as to dismantle the beauty industry and also to democratize beauty. Like, people are now voting with likes, if you will, right? And then mainstream media is getting shook because they're like, nobody's coming to our platforms anymore. Nobody's, subscribing to our magazines anymore. But at the same time, I see, what has shifted a little bit is that, and our community does need a source of income, but with influencing a lot of people, they see that as reality. So those new outfits that you see every day, oftentimes are gifted in exchange for advertising. So we become walking billboards, to influence others to buy and consume and things like that. And that's why I think part of that whole gold standard of what is plus size is coming into play, because of that mainstream influence. Is like, we have to sell something that's unattainable so that you can, and also that health part too. It is part of the healthcare industrial complex that healthy is thin, healthy is fit, but it's also no mistake that the majority of people don't look like that. Like, we don't, even in this pandemic, they're like, what are you doing to work out? What do you do? I'm on the couples are doing this and that together. And I'm like, I don't even have, like, there are people dying outside. And for some people that is an outlet, but for me, when it comes to like, you need to get in this type of shape and be this type of way to be accepted and loved and validated, I feel really stressed out about that. And part of that is selling product, right? It's selling you a gym, it's selling you, followers, it's selling you these shakes and like all of that type of stuff. So I'm hearing that and definitely affirming that. And Amy, I'd love for you to jump in terms of the state of plus size inclusion and queer fashion from a femme perspective? Because I know oftentimes we're not called to the table as part of that conversation.
Yeah, you know, something I think a lot about is talking about being plus sized and being femme, not to be confused with feminine. It's such a different world than most people think. You know, I think a lot of people will think queer is mask of center, queer is, you know, a lot of other things, but they don't really think about how femmes feel or how femmes are included or not. And, you know, when I go into, let's say, a Lane Bryant or an Eloquy or another plus size store, first of all, you know, the bodies don't look like mine. I don't see anybody who, you know, presents as queer in any way. There's no trans models that they're using. You know, there's lots of ways in which I don't really feel like that's my space either. I feel like, you know, another thing that we were talking about earlier is with all these different brands, there's no like one size chart. You know, there's every store you go to that's plus size, you have to, you know, say, am I a 16? Am I an 18? You know, what is this? And then you have to buy 4 things on the internet and hope that one of them fits, and then figure out if you don't miss the return time to then send it back. And, you know, we're put into this like secondary category or, you know, like class of people when we just want to go to a mall or go to a shopping center with our friends and be able to buy something, whether it's for a wedding, as you were talking about, or just to go out with our, you know, out at night with our friends. So, yeah, another thing that I was going to mention is, you know, a lot of Black and brown folks, Indigenous folks, are really hurt by the fashion industry. You know, we're like depleting the resources of our environment greatly. Like when we just make a pair of jeans, right? Tons of water is used for that. And the problem is that plus size folks can't really even get into sustainable fashion because most sustainable fashion brands don't make plus sizes. So when the majority of people are in plus size bodies, how are these brands actually helping the environment on a larger scale? You know, we're giving them a lot of credit saying you're doing such a good job, but like when the majority of people are plus size, how good of a job are you really doing? So, you know, I think that's also an important thing to discuss as well, given that, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color are often affected by those things. You know, more than other communities. So there's so much to say here, like, I don't know.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, because I didn't even think about the sustainability issue when we were kind of going through our talking points, but there are so many ways in which mainstream fashion and queer fashion are leaving out plus size folks in terms of, even if you wanted to be part of the sustainability movement, you can't even have that option because that option is not available to you. So thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate it. So now that we've talked a little bit about, you know, kind of the issues and obstacles that people are facing, I wanted to actually talk a little bit about Jahn's work. And if I can figure out this Zoom, again, I'm going to share a slide. Bear with me for a second. So, so Jahn, you actually styled our first ever fashion show. A lot of people believe that we've only been at Brooklyn Museum, but in 2011, we had our very first fashion show. It was a queer country fashion show that you styled and photographed, and you actually curated each of the pieces, and it came from your Brooklyn dry goods collection, which I'd like for you to speak about. But, you know, one of the things that a lot of our readers come to us and share with us is that they don't have any brands, any one brand or brands that they go to regularly because there's not a large offering. So they have to spend an exorbitant amount of time going to various resources to pull things together just to put together one outfit. And you do that very well. So I was wondering what types of fit tips you could offer and troubleshooting tips you might be able to offer to our audience.
Well, it might be very obvious to a crowd like ours. There are people that are afraid of dressing outside of gender. And I think one of the things that you have to realize as a larger person, if you want to have a larger pool of things to shop from, you have to also be willing to shop items that may be, you know, for me to shop traditionally women's items. Or vice versa. To me, I don't understand why that exists. We should all just wear whatever the hell we want. I don't understand why we have to gender clothing so strictly. but it's about, for me, I think what has happened is I've been able to identify sort of a uniform. And I have a feeling that most larger bodies or people in larger bodies have to do that because we don't have as many options. So when we find something that works, we tend to latch onto it and wear multiples of those items in varying ways and everything else.
Mhm.
With Brooklyn Dry Goods specifically, that project, all the clothing that was worn was secondhand. So Brooklyn Dry Goods was all about creating an aspirational space for secondhand clothing, and to carry every single size. So from very small sizes, I know that we shared photos of some of the larger models that were featured during the show, but we also had much smaller models. And our goal is to fit everybody and to do it in an aspirational way and to do it secondhand, so we weren't necessarily going outside and buying mass market clothing. Some of the clothing they are wearing happens to be mass market, but it is all secondhand, which means that somebody has either donated it or sold it, and then I went ahead and found it and am repurposing it, restyling it, and re-expressing it, I guess, in a new way. I still do that to this day. One of my favorite things to do is to scour. I could spend all day in thrift stores looking for things that may work. Again, it's still limiting, but I do find things that work. I think that we also have to really get comfortable in the idea beyond outside of dressing outside of like our gender, also just being open to what styles do exist. I think a lot of times we say to ourselves, I can't wear that, that's not me, or this is not me, because we've been sort of prescribed an ideal as to what's supposed to be right and wrong for us, as opposed to potentially being like, you know what, I'm going to give this a shot. So there are times for sure when I was growing up and younger that I took specific risks getting dressed and ultimately got teased for it at some points, because I was like, all right, so this is not something I would first pick out, but I'm going to try this because it's available in my size. And then you style it, you put it together in a way that you feel confident in, and that confidence radiates out, and suddenly that thing that you didn't think you can wear becomes a staple in your wardrobe. So I think just being really open to playing. I mean, for this particular project with dapperQ, I was inspired by two things. I was inspired by the Dust Bowl and sort of the idea that people were using and reusing and repairing their clothing and everything else from the secondhand perspective and the sustainability perspective. But then also I wanted to sort of be inspired by aspirational, cis men that we look to in advertising, even dating back to the turn of the century. And I was inspired by somebody named J.C. Leyendecker, who was a queer artist in the teens and 20s, who created advertising and imagery that were the cover of magazine covers and everything else, and actually came right before and sort of inspired people like Norman Rockwell. J.C. Leyendecker openly used queer models and sort of put them in these situations and in outfits like these that were classic. And so it sort of was this amazing dichotomy of these like unknown queer models selling products to the masses in the teens and 20s because J.C. Leyendecker chose the models, chose the look. So this was all inspired by that. This is easily, you can create this look by going to various thrift stores. Once you buy these clothing and maybe you mix it with some mass market product because that's all that's available, you then have it tailored. I know that this is not available to everybody, and it's certainly not available to me at all times, which is why my wedding suit couldn't be salvaged. It can be cost prohibitive, but if you have a local tailor in your neighborhood who can tweak things ever so slightly, suddenly those pieces that you buy in a thrift store and may not fit just right can fit and can look great. And that way you're also customizing the garments. They can take care of any little repairs that need to be done, especially if you're dealing with secondhand goods. And it's going to give much more life to those products, and you're going to feel a lot better wearing them. So I feel like there are so many ways to kind of go about it. What I really loved about this particular fashion show is that all the models were wearing secondhand clothing, and to me they all look like $1 million.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. This was one of our favorite fashion shows. And I also think that what was really interesting about your styling in that is today's, especially in mainstream fashion, is it gets kind of lazy where they're like, this is gender neutral, and basically it's just sweatpants, as if like ordinary sweatpants like were that gendered. I mean, unless you got like the big, you know, juicy on the butt, or, you know, some, you know, something ridiculous like that. But, you know, a gray Champion sweatshirt all of a sudden becomes, you know, gender neutral. And what I really liked about your styling was that it showed how people from all over the nation, if you were interested in dressing kind of like country or preppy, or like with the Ariel wearing the Ivy bomber, that you could do that, but it does take a certain amount of extra time and effort. And on that note, I wanted to turn it over to you, Amy, because on the tailoring front, when masked folks write into dapperQ, they're like, how do I achieve this style that I'm constantly seeing on Instagram, as Kay had mentioned? And it's all about tailoring, and tailoring costs a lot of money. But they also assume that if you're femme, you can just walk into a store and pick anything off the rack and that it's going to fit you, no matter your size. And we all know that that's not true, right? There's a sample size, and usually larger sizes are scaled up from a small or medium prototype without taking into any account larger chest sizes, larger waist sizes, larger hips, different size thighs, different heights, you know, broader shoulders, or anything like that. So I was wondering, because your Instagram is on fire, I'm going to try to pull it up without messing up this entire Zoom. But I was wondering in the meantime, if you could provide some fit tips for femme folks out there in terms of troubleshooting, given the lack of options.
Sure, yeah. You know, I have some of the same tips actually, but one thing just for folks to understand is that these brands, they'll pick a fit model, and they'll have like the same fit model, and that's the body type that they're basically dressing for. So if, let's say, she's an hourglass, then that's how the clothes are going to fit. So if you're an apple shape, you're going to have trouble with that brand. So for me, what's helped is I shop different brands, and because I'm a blogger, I can usually just contact a brand and say, hey, send me over something, you know, and I can try those clothes, and I sort of stick to the brands I know. So that's sort of like a big tip. You're lucky if the brand that fits you is the brand that kind of makes clothes in the style you like. But sort of like with being queer, I feel like I have had to do a lot of finagling of clothes to make it feel like my most authentic self. So, you know, there, like I was mentioning earlier, when if I walk into a Lane Bryant store, they may have like really flowery dresses, and, you know, I'm not really seeing anything that kind of is like my hard femme self necessarily, but I do often like to play with more feminine looks, but I would probably add like a leather moto jacket or some, you know, black ankle boots or something, and really like change it up. So that's one way that I go about it, I would say. I love brands like Eloquii because I feel like they play with different things a lot. I've seen some Mask of Center folks wear Eloquii suits because they fit their body type and shape, but they're a suit, and so they're pretty suits. There's like this one that they made a couple years ago that had some type of a flower motif, and I saw a lot of queer folks sporting that on Instagram, and I thought that was so cute. But, you know, one thing that was really like a small point is, you know, last year when I was at H&M looking for Pride looks for like a last minute trip to Pride here in LA, they had nothing in plus sizes. They had a ton of rainbow stuff. Everything's LGBT. We love all the gays, like queers come in here. And then you get to the section and I literally could only buy a fanny pack. It's a cute fanny pack, but like I needed something to wear, you know? So that's always frustrating. But one thing, like one other tip I would say is always review the size chart, because as I mentioned, they have particular fit models. So you need to know how your size translates to their size chart. So if you can invest in, a measuring tape, that's a good idea. So you can kind of know where you fit in. I would say if there's a brand you love, but the price is really high, check out any sort of fashion, plus size fashion resale stores here in Los Angeles. I go to the Plus Bus all the time. I know there's a store in New York, Plus Brooklyn, I think, and there's a few other around the country. There's one in Seattle, I believe. They're all around, but it's basically like a Crossroads or a Beacon's Closet, but it's all plus sizes. So it's a great place if you're trans and you don't really fit into most like women's, cisgender women's store clothing. You can also go to stores like that. And I would say find bloggers with your body type. Most bloggers are very open about telling you what size they wear in a particular garment. I've had girls ask me, like what size that dress is that I wore, and oftentimes the dress size was a different size than the suit that I wore. So I help out in that way too. So I would say reach out to bloggers, to find out, so that way you don't make the mistake of, buying a 18 when you should have got a 22 or, whatever. But what I think there's a really great opportunity in this though. As a queer femme and as someone who's plus size, I feel like, I get to play. I feel like as queer people, there are no rules in how you express your gender. If you, have these body parts or these body parts, it doesn't mean you have to stick to those clothes that are assigned to that. So I've enjoyed being queer and being able to express my gender however I want. Some days I'm more masc, some days I'm more femme, some days I'm in between. And when you're plus size, you also kind of have that struggle, but there's the opportunity there too. I have fallen in love with vintage clothing because I can turn a vintage blazer into a dress. I can, make something out of something else. And it's really fun to play in that way. I don't think that we should have to do that, but that is something that's kind of nice. And, I feel like on some, cosmic level, we're being encouraged to do that because that's what our struggle is here. And then one other last point I was just going to say is, it's so frustrating because I feel like when you have these like intersectional identities, it's like pick a struggle, they say, like, well, okay, are you plus size or are you queer? Because a lot of queer brands may or may not carry plus sizes. And if you are plus size, but you're not femme, like, okay, so then, where do you go then to get, clothes that fit your body? Or a lot of like stores for men don't fit the proportions that some Mask of Center folks have. So, it's really frustrating is the point. But I say have fun with it and find folks who look like you, because they are out there. That's why I do the Instagram thing, because, I know that folks feel good seeing someone that looks like them be happy and fat and love the skin that I'm in,
Yeah, thank you for sharing it. And I love your Instagram, and it's inspired me. And I've seen your journey because we were Facebook friends a while back. And I remember, there was some times that you had been posting about, really trying hard to lose weight. And then, there was this time where I saw this kind of journey and this self-acceptance, and you just blossomed on Instagram. And then I was like, this narrative and your beauty, it was just so radiant, and your style is on point. Like, you found your groove. And every time I go shopping, I take your Instagram with me, because my body is constantly changing too. And I'll, share very honestly with you. I come from a family of round folks. I was never naturally thin. And in college, I decided that I wanted to be the size 0. And the more weight that I lost, I ended up taking off 60 pounds, but the more weight that I lost, the more validation I got. And it wasn't just in mainstream society. I grew up in Albuquerque. We had one queer bar there, and they had one lesbian night, which is on Wednesday nights. I still remember it. But the more weight I lost, the more attention I got. And I saw that my self-worth was really wrapped into that. And I did this almost for 15 years. I remained a size 0, and remaining a size 0 was a lot of work. It took up a lot of my headspace. I was counting calories. I couldn't go out and eat cake or anything like that. And then on November 6th, 2016, something happened. I won't say what, because y'all know what it is. But I was just like, I'm going to eat a pint of ice cream. And then I just started eating pizza and ice cream and donuts and all of these things that just were like, why have I been missing all of this stuff? My life is so short, and I've been depriving myself of this. But along came with that was none of my clothes in my closet fit anymore. People in the community stopped validating me as much. People would make comments about how much weight I've gained. they would nudge me to like, oh, you know, maybe you should just exercise a little bit, do a little. And now, now that I have inspiration from folks like you, and I can take, you know, my phone with me and see your blog or your Instagram when I go shopping, I am just like, I can look that fly. It may take a little extra time, but I know that I can do it. And it also creates like a different creativity in me, because when I was a size 0, I was just going in and being like, oh, I see that on the mannequin, that's what I'm going to wear. And now it's kind of like, let me see what I can put together. So it's a unique challenge, and it's a fun challenge, and like you said, we shouldn't have to do those things. But I think there does open up a lot of opportunity there. So
I just want to say thank you so much for saying that, Fem. Like, I really appreciate all of your love. You've been such a great support, and I'm such a fan of yours too. So, but one thing I wanted to say is that, you know, when I started the Chief of Style, it really was a fake it till you make it kind of project. I did not like my body. It was a struggle my whole life. I grew up half in LA, half in Orange County. So like everything you've heard of Orange County is true. It's very much like if you're white, skinny, you know, that's the ideal body type. So I never felt like I fit in. I never felt beautiful when I lived there. And it was really through kind of just getting tired of of like doing the same thing, like that rat race of just trying to keep weight off. So I created the Chief of Style, faking it till I made it. And I did, I made it, you know. I really didn't like my body, but after posting photos and having other girls like the picture, and then I'd go check out their Instagram and see like, oh my God, they're like me. And I just kind of created this little community online. My like self-perception really changed. So if there's someone out there who just doesn't feel so great, I would suggest create a little Instagram, take some cute pictures, start posting them. Like, you know, if you don't see yourself in a magazine, put yourself on the internet. Like, you know, it's real, it's true.
Yeah, absolutely. That was definitely something that, you know, one of the reasons why BBH started doing the things, we were just like, we can't wait. So we're just gonna have to do it ourselves. And I was also going to add, for folks who might, you know, really want to shop maybe in like urban wear stores, like the Detail R's, things like that, that typically have larger sizes, but you do have to get them tailored. You know, if you find yourself some really good basics. I love black tees. I love white tees. I love things like that, that I can either tailor and, you know, if you find something on ASOS that you might like, or you have a local person that you want to support. I love stuff from Sun, for instance, drop crotch pants. But accessorizing is like my jam. Like, that's one of the reasons why I so heavily accessorize, is one, as a person of size, it's, you know, if I can add a vest, or, you know, I can add another piece to it. It's also very ancestral for me. Adornment is very important for me to do that, that type of adornment for myself, to put on different pieces and jewelry and things that I layer on top of other pieces that I might find in, you know, my local African shop that's selling some beautiful fabric that I want to maybe convert to a vest or something like that. So not always necessarily relying on brands to make you feel fly, but maybe, you know, it's about those extra glasses or something else that you can add to a piece that makes it pop, you know? So, yeah.
If it's
Well,
already,
Go ahead.
necklaces, scarves, hats always fit, you know? So that's always like what you can count on.
hats, gloves, scarves, bags. I wanted to just also, while we're talking on this, and we've talked a little bit about tailoring things and customizing things. What I'm wearing now are very simple pieces, but they were both customized. And it's just, again, this is not available to everyone, but if you have a friend who can sew that you'd like to support, there are so many things that we can do to support our community in our bid to express ourselves through clothing. Whether you've got a friend who's a great artist and might be able to paint a simple sweatshirt for you. You know, I've customized a lot of my clothing, whether it's through dyeing it or working with a friend who can draw or do some needlepoint or do some customization on it. In the case with the shirt that I'm wearing, it's 2 different $15 shirts that I had somebody cut in half and sew back together so it looked like it was 2 different shirts. I'll often buy something, you know, the trend right now is to wear things that are oversized. And oftentimes larger bodies aren't afforded that, because when we wear the largest size, we're lucky if it fits us. So about really seeking out even the most basic items. The sweatshirt I'm wearing, I maybe spent $20 for it. It's a large, I think it's an 8X, and I had it cropped. And suddenly I wear it, and someone is, somebody, I'm walking through a trade show, and someone's like, oh, is that so-and-so? And I was like, oh, I wish they made my size. They don't, but thank you very much. So it's about sort of thinking outside the box, which I think as the queer community, we've done our entire lives just to survive. And it's facing the fact that you live in a larger body shouldn't limit you if you start getting creative. I know friends of mine in larger bodies who've learned to take up things like embroidery, and they'll custom embroider something, or they'll dye something, or they've learned, I should learn how to sew. I haven't, but thankfully I've got friends, and I'm happy to Venmo. If any of you guys are amazing designers out there, please let me know. I'd like to support your work. But I feel like we've gone through a lot of challenges, and we're going to be going through a lot of challenges. Let's take this opportunity in terms of our expression, which should be joyful and should be positive and should be uplifting, and allow it to push our own creativity and to push our own ideas as to what's available to us. If it's not available, let's try to make it if we can. And of course, like my love of secondhand product, you can take a secondhand garment that you spend $2 or $3 on and spend another $2 to $3 or $5 to customize it in so many different ways. And if people have questions about that, I'm happy to help talk you through various customization things you can do to your clothing. But it doesn't always, I think we have this idea, especially with where we see things going online, that things either have to be very, very, very expensive to be valid, or have to be really, really cheap because it comes in our size. And there is a middle balance of, I think we were talking about finding these basics. If you can find your black t-shirt, Van had talked about finding this perfect black t-shirt, do 10 of them and change them up, embroider one, maybe do some, I was doing these things, I was able to find larger t-shirts, and I just bought a bunch of them, and I started playing with bleach and dyes and started doing these weird sort of like camo things. And then I found this amazing queer artist who was able to paint, who was painting over camouflage with bright colors. So they take a piece of the camouflage and just paint over it. And these are the things that we're all sort of staying at home and staying safe, are things that we can be doing within our homes right now. Like, this is the time to explore. And if you want to practice first, practice on a pair of socks. You don't have to go crazy, but start thinking of ways that you can actually take your existing wardrobe and make it yourself to be more reflective of who you are. And it could take time, and it's going to be a lot of trial and error. I messed up a lot of things along the way, but once you figure it out, it's incredibly empowering.
One thing I was going to piggyback on that and just add that it's, I don't think we should forget our activist roots as queer folks. And I think it's important to let brands know, hey, I think you should extend your sizing. The more times they hear that, the more they know that they'll actually have customers to buy the products, because that's why they don't do it. They're scared they're not going to sell. But even if it's just, hey, all you like fat friends of mine, like, let's all DM this brand or email the CEO of this brand and let them know, like, we want to wear your clothes, we want to buy them, but you don't make them in our size. So, and I've done that with a lot of sustainable brands. I've had that conversation, and I've said the whole point that, like, most people are above a size 14, or at least a 14. So why aren't you at least making a 14? Not to mention all the other sizes, but.
Just to add a tiny bit more to that, I've been able to work with trade shows, so I have access to brands, and I'm not afraid to go up to any of those brands and be like, I love your stuff, you don't make my size. What can we do about that? And you can do that if you go to your local boutiques, whether they're queer owned or otherwise. Go in and say, I'd love to shop here, but there's nothing in my size. And keep doing that. Over time, you might get a positive response. I literally see 1,000 brands at the trade shows, and very few of them address the needs of either the queer, trans, or larger bodies, much less all of them combined in any variation. But a couple brands are at least saying, you're right, we should make bigger sizes. And I'm currently working with a couple brands very slowly. Things have slowed down considerably because of COVID-19. But trying to help them and I've offered my services for free. I'll say, look, I'm going to do this for free. I'm going to come in as a consultant with my background and help you guys build clothing that I can buy from you because I love your brand and I'd like to wear it. But it takes a lot of us to do that constantly to see that change. So I'm really, really glad you brought that up, Amy. It's important that we kind of, as you said, advocate for ourselves as we would anything else.
Yeah, Amy, I also wanted to talk to you about that, actually all of you about that, to see what your feelings were about this particular concept that keeps being brought to dapperQ. So when we accept applications for our fashion show, part of the designer contract is that there has to be body diversity. That's very hard to enforce. I mean, that would require me actually suing somebody if they didn't do it. But I oftentimes get pushback from queer designers because they say that their sizing is limited because they are an independent brand and they cannot bring it to scale. That sometimes when they've gone outside and brought extra small or extra large clothing, that people want it, say they want it online, but aren't buying it. First of all, I wanted to know if you're calling BS on that. And second of all, I wanted to know how we could better then support our brands, because oftentimes as independent brands, they cannot offer the same pricing as a Forever 21. So is there a way that we can all as consumers support them and they can better support us?
Hey, can I say something about that really quick, Anita? I think there's one thing about production and saying it's available. I feel like that's a trope that people say in academia or culturally, well, we have this Black chapter, we have this disabled, but who's going to read it, right? And I think with fashion and large fashion, it's like, but what is your PR with it? Who are your models? Because there's clearly a need, but if fat folks don't witness themselves on your brand, why would they purchase it, right? If you don't have fat folks at leadership, fat models. So, it's that weird catch-22 where it's like, well, we had it, but you didn't buy it. So then again, it's putting the onus on folks, right, who don't have access to that fashion. So me personally, like, for somebody who's trying to find fashion that is of large size, that's also for various disabled bodies, like, if I don't see nobody who are my people, right, why am I going to want to invest that money? Because there are pieces. I will, Sun, Stuzo, Rebirth Garments, I will invest. I will save up and buy those clothes because I know that they can move in my body the way I feel comfortable. And I witness that's reflected. So it's not just about making something and being like, it's there, right? That's such an insular perspective, I feel.
Agreed. I'm just going to say that. Like, I call BS. I agree. It's something that Kay and I actually oftentimes talk about around, just like, if you don't actually reach out or put the bodies out there or have models, which I have been to modeling calls and I see those bodies there and they don't get casted. Those folks get left out of campaigns. And so I do call BS because I've actually seen the behind the scenes of it. And get to see who actually gets chosen, right? And constantly see the same people, the same bodies. And so I am definitely calling BS on that, right? And I'm sure that it is definitely an extra cost, but if you make it and you actually are intentional and you want to have folks show up, you have to work just as hard for those folks to show up too, and not just put it out there and say, well, clickbait, hopefully people will see it, right? But get some folks that actually reflect the community in which you're trying to advertise to,
Yeah, I agree. I think it's kind of like that same narrative too, where, yeah, there's people in development, there's artists, but, this book isn't going to sell because, Minda Harts came and spoke at an event that I did recently, and her book is like the Black woman version of Lean In, and people kept telling her, well, we already have Lean In. I think that's very similar in fashion too, where it's like they can't imagine anybody that is not in these narrow scopes of like beauty norms actually buying their clothing. And if they do have it, it's just kind of half marketed, like, okay, we'll offer it, but then, like as you mentioned, Van, on a post, it's like there's a triple XL, but the model online is thin and white, and how can I even imagine myself in that, what that would look like on me, right? I mean, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, very much appreciative to the dapperQ platform, because you let me actually write a piece on it a few years ago, in which I kind of hit a huge slump in my mental health, as somebody who has anxiety and depression, and was getting just constant kind of rejections around people wanting that, you know, saying that they want this visibility in the brands, but it was like just not there. And so I remember, and this is before, you know, and I'm gonna particularly look at this brand because that's what happened to me. I was on ASOS, and this is before ASOS Plus came out. And I remember looking online and I was like, okay, cool, I see 2X, I see 3X, but I have no idea in terms of models, like if this would even fit me, if this would even look good on me. When we talk about plus size models, particularly for masculine and center folks, it's typically, it's like you were saying, Anita, it's like about the V shape, or brawn, like big and tall, right? But it's, if you're a shorter person like myself, it's just not happening. People are not looking at you. And it really began to deeply just impact my just overall mental health around visibility and not seeing myself. And as somebody who does take testosterone, and my body has changed over the last, you know, few years of being on T, and being like, okay, you know, I have to constantly reshop or constantly retailer things because my body is changing. And so I urge brands to think about the psychological impact of this exclusion, right? To think about when you come up with that really amazing visibility campaign that you think is going to be great, and then you bring it out and it's the same people or the same bodies, you know, people are looking and seeing who you're not including. And so, you know, I am happy to be thought partners with people. I'm happy to, you know, connect people to communities that are looking to see themselves reflected. But I call BS on it. And I know anytime that if I go to parties or things like that, or parties that we're throwing, and we all show up and we're all looking fly, and people are asking, where do you get that outfit? Where do you do this? You know, and I tell them, and then they go and they're like, yeah, but I don't see anything that looks like me. You know, that exclusion really hurts people. So I'm just going to put that out there, just, you know, around thinking about mental health and how fashion, as we say it, is just, it's always going to be political, and people are going to feel that exclusion in very, very real ways.
If I could also just sort of piggyback on that, because you bring up so many good points. You know, more recently, during Fashion Week, both Marc Jacobs and Christian Siriano showed plus sizes on the runway. But how much of those items are actually then made available for purchase? So there's this notion that you know, it's a start, and we have to start thinking of like, in terms of like tokenism, or the idea that this is being put on the runway to promote of the brand in a larger sense, but not actually addressing the needs of either the queer or community of people, you know, bigger body people. I always have this, and I'd like to hear from all of you if you guys don't mind. I'm really curious because this is a battle that I have within myself often. I'll see these things. I'll be like, all right, Marc Jacobs, a major designer, is showing like plus sizes on the runway. That's amazing. But then part of me gets enraged because I don't see the change. I don't see that item available. I don't see. So part of me is like, all right, it's a step, but is it the right step, or is it something where it's just for show, and it's just about trying to get likes, or just to get followers, or just to get, you know, a good headline? I'd love to hear what everyone has to say about that, because I feel like sometimes brands try to come in And then other people immediately are like, oh, well, they're just in it for the money. It's a cash grab. It's a this or a that. And I will tell you right now, if brands like Marc Jacobs or Christian Siriano wanted to make my size, I'll throw you my cash, but you actually need to follow up with it. But I'm just wondering if you guys feel like that sort of representation when you see an advertisement for Target and they're using a bigger body or they're using a differently abled body. Like, is that helping our cause? Or is it only helping if they really push it further than what they do currently?
Well, I definitely think that pushing it further is where we should be headed. You know, the interesting thing, like fashion is, we're not talking about clothes makers and clothing. We're talking about fashion. You know, like this is a huge industry. And it's based on aspirational wealth, aspirational, you know, notions of beauty, and those things are systemic. It's based on how much money you have. The more money, the better. What body size you have, the skinnier, the better. What your skin tone is, the lighter, the better. You know, like it's so ingrained in this. So yes, we need more visibility. I would never, you know, poo-poo Marc Jacobs or Christian Siriano having a plus size person on the runway. No, I wouldn't. But yes, it's like, are you putting your money where your mouth is kind of thing? Or yeah, your mouth or your mouth, I don't know, something. But one thing I was going to say to the earlier point that I think still relates is that, you know, some of these indie brands are the ones who are catering to queer folks. And I know that it is a struggle. Like, I do call BS, but I do still think that there is a struggle financially for some of these brands to carry a larger range of sizes. That said, you know, one easy option is to go on your social media channels, speaking to brands, and say, hey, we want to do some pre-sales. Like, anybody want, you know, this size, this size, this size, you know, you can buy this now. Here's what it'll look like. You know, change your business model. You know, obviously we cannot work with the same systems that are here to oppress us. We have to create new systems. So maybe this sort of like pre-sale model, or, you know, kind of like more bespoke fashion, but doing that at large scale. You know, there's a lot of different ways, and, you know, I'd like to think up some more, and maybe I'll do a post on that or something. But I do think that there's ways that we can kind of get it all going, you know, but visibility is very important. So.
Hi to the pup. So we were slated to end at 4, but I think we're having a really great conversation. And I just want to end on something that Amy and Kay had brought up in talking points, but it's open to anyone. And just at the end of the day, it's who gets to call themselves fat. And particularly because the plus size industry has also become very aspirational in the sense that there is an unattainable standard kind of look that they're seeking, and that is the hourglass figure, that slim fit look where fat is acceptable for feminine folks if it's carried in your breast, your hips, and your butt, but you best have that flat tummy, right? Or for masculine folks, it's usually that V cut with the broad shoulders, tall, you know, can't be short, got to be tall, broad shoulders, and it's got to taper down into this unattainable waist. So I just wanted to get some, you know, ideas and conversations from you, Kay, Amy, and anybody else who wants to chime in about inclusion and diversity within plus size.
Yeah, I mean, there's not so much. It was more a question posed, I think. I'm really curious about what that means and what that means for all kinds of fashion. I feel, again, I'm at the intersections of privilege, of being disabled and being larger size, not being considered super disabled, whatever that means, or super crip, and not being super fat, right? So I'm always curious about who gets to hold that texture of being the token, and why that is. And then how that is mainstreamed, right? It's when I see, oftentimes it's fat fashion, or I see disabled fashion, it's always the same, again, 2-3 people. So who are the people who are not necessarily gatekeeping, but I want to know, like, how everyone is touched. How are we making this more collective? I feel Amy has brought some really pivotal points around restructuring and innovating, like our capitalist thinking about what fashion and style are. You know, so for me, it's like, what ways can we really challenge? I'm not interested in skinny fit approval. First off, do you know, like, if you're going to talk about who my demographics are who follow me, they are disabled, POC, poor working class, not skinny, fat folks, right? So for me, it's like, when we are of our own, I think some excellent points were put. How do we push pressure on media, on influencers, on people who style, to gain that momentum? And I want us to also be aware about what happens when our hearts are broken there, because they're not going to feed us. You know, that's how organizing works. So I think my curiosity is expanded, and I would love to hear what Amy and the other panelists have to say.
To that point about influencers, you know, like, I know a lot of people want to hold influencers accountable, but as like a quasi-influencer, I will say that it's really frustrating, because I feel like sometimes when I wear outfits that really give me an hourglass shape, then that gets more likes, more comments, more engagement. And then I'll post something else that may not, you know, have that same kind of shape or whatever, and it doesn't get as, you know, many likes or comments or, you know, whatever. And that applies to lots of different things that we can probably all, you know, deduce. But I think that we really, as influencers, especially when we're cutie pock, like, we need more love and support. And, you know, we're out here really trying to, like, put the community on the map and have these brands care about our people, you know? So I really think, instead of like, the attitude a lot of people have about influencers or bloggers is that, like, oh God, they just have like this perfect life. Well, no, it's not. It's, yes, that's very much for a photo. We all know this by now, but we're trying to do more than that, than just look like we have the perfect life. At least that's for me. I'm trying to be as real as I possibly can and get more folks to feel like they have a voice and that they have someone who's going to push the envelope for them. And hopefully they'll join in. So yes, but I think with the whole question of who gets to call themselves fat, fat is not a feeling, fat is an identity. So I don't think if you just feel fat, you should be able to call yourself fat. At the same time, I really feel like, if you're fat, you kind of know you're fat. Like, it's just, you know, something innate in you. You just know if that's you, it's you, you know? So I would never police someone from saying that they're fat if I think, oh, well, you're a 10, you don't count. That size 10 is maybe bigger than the rest of her friends. And, you know, she may not be able to find clothes because she's a bridge size. And so it's sometimes hard to find 10 and up clothing. But I think at the end of the day, we have to examine our own internalized fat phobia. You know, as queer people and queer people who are fat, we have had many messages that really, you know, bring us down throughout our lives. And I feel like this whole, like, frontier of eliminating fat phobia is like what our mission needs to be, because it affects us from so many angles. So yeah, I don't know if that answered the question, but
I would have to agree. I think, you know, I carry a ton of privilege because I am a taller person. I'm a cisgender male. But it even goes into being a larger person, because I will proudly say to friends, oh, I'm a fat guy. I'm fat, you know, and my BMI proves that I'm fat. But my friends, and I think it's in part because of this privilege, are like, no, you're just big. And part of me is enraged by that, because we're taking away the beauty that exists in just being fat. Don't be like, oh, you're just big. No, be fat and own it. It doesn't mean that you know, I think Kay brought this earlier. He said, oh my gosh, I just lost it for a second. But I want to know what is fat. And I think, to your point, Amy, there's this identity that if you have lived the fat experience and you know the challenges that exist, and it might mean that you're a size 10 and all your friends are thinner and you have a harder time. Society has created such a narrow view of what's acceptable in terms of body shape that I think a lot of people identify as fat because if they don't look like the one thing, they're fat. And I don't want to take that from them, but I think it really, if you're living that sort of fat experience and you've cried in a dressing room because something cannot fit you, or you've gone shopping with all your friends and they can all buy stuff at the stores and you can't, I think it's safe to say that you're fat. And don't try to qualify and say, oh, you're just big, you're just thick, you're just that. Just let us be fat and let us be beautiful and let us be bold. I don't think that anyone would ever do that in terms of any of our other identifiers. They wouldn't be like, oh, you're not really this, you're just that. You know, for some reason in fat, there's so much shame around being fat that you can't just be fat. It has to be, you know, so it's so bad, it's such a bad word that it's suddenly, even if you call yourself proudly fat, those around you want to discount that somehow. And that also discounts the experience, and that's not okay with me.
So Van, I was wondering if you wanted to add a few points, because, you know, John was talking about his friends just saying, oh, he's just big. But at the intersection of race, right, and also masculinity and size, what types of other challenges do plus size mass folks face that maybe somebody who's white doesn't face in terms of how they're viewed in society?
Right. You know, one of the things, and I wrote about this in the article, in terms of, like, you know, being a Black person, being a queer person, a mass person, is also the, you know, when we talk about policing of the bodies, literally policing of the bodies, right? And the dangers, you know, or being seen as dangerous, because my body literally is taking up more space, right? You know, I talked about being followed around in stores and not knowing, you know, what that might have been about, you know, or just kind of the overall policing and being seen as a danger overall for folks, right? And I also think that there's, like, this very interesting, when we talk about colorism, right, this very interesting intersection that happens around, okay, cool, you might see more visibility for there are bigger bodies that are being seen, but they are lighter, right? Or they are deemed as more passable. You know, when I think about transmasculine communities who has access, or, you know, seeing people with who have top surgeries as more desirable, right? And knowing that that's not everybody's journey. Not everybody wants that even, you know, and so having those bodies being seen as more consumable or more desirable for brands and things like that. And so at the intersection of all these things, we have to think about who's being the most harmed, and how much violence is being ensued when it comes to even thinking about bodies that might be bigger, seeing bodies as more of a threat than anything else. So, you know, I just wanted to put that out there, but I thank you for asking me.
Anita, can I add one small thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to actually shout out some of the work being done by No Body is Disposable and No ICU Eugenics, which focuses and centers fat bodies. And I mean, when we're thinking about, for me, what is fat, is like they're institutional, as everybody said, they're institutional obstructions and oppressions that are impacting fat people on an everyday basis. If we consider the pandemic currently in COVID and getting hospital care, access to medical care, there are immediate moral empire colonial impositions on fat bodies. So for me, I think, you know, that's something that is constantly on the throng when I'm doing disability justice with fat justice movement, like thinking about those things. And so if we're thinking about our aesthetic, I just want, you know, when we're thinking about design and fashion, to really put the context of, like, you know, fat-centered work is the centered work. Just like for me, disability justice work is the centered work. Black and Indigenous work is a centered work. So for me, I feel it's very important to overlap all those things, because those are people being very impacted, not just in fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that's a good note to share or to end on, because of we're having this context in a conversation in the context of a larger health crisis. And I think that there's a common thread that's shared through all of these experiences, right? Whether it's healthcare or fashion, and visibility. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you to all of the panelists who joined us today. I do want to, as you all sign off, I am going to share that slide again. So if you tuned in and you liked what the panelists had to say, I recommend, finding them on Instagram, following them there, and also donating to their Venmo, whether they're personal freelancers. It's really important to support our queer communities at this time. And then also Jahn is going to be donating his donations, if any come through, to an organization that serves LGBTQ youth. And I think that we could talk about this for hours, and I'm looking forward to having many more discussions with you. But you all inspire me, and I'm really happy to have you as part of the dapperQ family. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
All right.
Was there any way of knowing how many people were signed in?
I'm not sure.
I was trying to figure that out.
Now I'm trying to figure out how to, oh, down here. Thank you, everyone. I'll be sure to follow you all online. You guys are awesome.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Y'all take care.
Take care.